Off we go. Whoops. Can you see that clearly?
We see it.
Oh, yes. Good. Okay, that's good. So yeah, thank you for letting me come and share my experiences and information on agroforestry. Just to correct you, Sarah, I have a degree in agriculture and a master's in soil science, but not in geography. But,
sorry.
but I guess it's similar. What I'm going to do is take you through some sorts of thought processes around agroforestry and the role it can play, and then also the experiences of my own farming business in Cambridgeshire over the next 40 minutes. So we all recognise, I think, that there is increased competition for our land, whether that's from population growth or energy or housing or forestry. There are a lot of competing interests. But at the same time, we're having to deal with adapting our farming systems to the impacts of climate change, whether that be too dry or too wet, storms or drought. We have to adapt our farming systems. And we know that there are some real challenges for agriculture. There is a question of whether high input monocultural systems are fit for purpose going forward. Are they yesterday's approach? We have to use inputs which are becoming more expensive and perhaps less available through legislative restrictions, but we need to increase productivity, use resources better, and also protect and enhance biodiversity. So some big challenges for farmers. To put it in context from my own perspective here in the UK, you can see we're quite a different environment than Sweden. We've got 4.6 million hectares of arable land. We're largely a grass country with nearly 12 million hectares of grass and a small amount of woodland, only 1.3 million hectares. So we're largely a grassland country, which contrasts quite considerably to Sweden. But our biggest challenge, perhaps, like any farmers, is the weather. Here, at least, it's never very cold and never very warm. So it's a very mild climate, and rainfall is always the month when we start to harvest crops in July and August. So that's always a challenge. In contrast, in relation to tree cover, we have a target in the UK to try and reach 16% tree cover from our current 11%. If you contrast the UK to Sweden, you can see a lot more tree cover in Sweden, a smaller area of agricultural land. In the UK, it's pretty much the reverse, but I think there are some commonalities in terms of how we might be able to utilise agroforestry. In essence, whether we are a farmer, a forester, or a solar engineer, we're all in the same business. As some of the previous speakers mentioned, we're in the businesses of harvesting sunlight and turning that into carbon, which we can either use for fuel or food or to feed animals. So we're all in the same game. And one of the things that interested me about agroforestry was that in the role of capturing sunlight, in our northern climates, the sunlight hours usually follow these patterns. But if we're in cereal production, there are periods of the year in late July, August, and September when there's near maximum solar radiation, and we turn those solar panels off. We're drying crops in the field, but we're not building new carbon. And it's that new carbon in the soil which actually drives productivity and food production. So it got me thinking about how we might be able to close the gap and keep the solar panels turned on during those maximum sunlight months. I think it's recognised that trees are important for climate change adaptation as lungs of the planet. So my question really was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, could trees have an important role in agriculture, and could agroforestry be an alternative approach? And You'll have heard this from the previous speakers, but typically agroforestry is either silvopastoral with animals or silvo-arable with crops, like Shell has just been showing. But the important thing for me is that there should be a significant ecological or economic interaction, principally a benefit from having the trees and all the animals and all the crops grown in the same place rather than separately. So agroforestry is a hybrid farming system. It's a modern system, taking the best of forestry, taking the best of agriculture and trying to mix them. And it's the complementary combinations of the key elements. It's not a new idea. This is a picture from Western France near Le Mans in the 20th century, and it shows a very different landscape that we see today. The landscape has been changed significantly by the Common Agricultural Policy throughout Europe, where farmers were encouraged to remove trees, or if not encouraged, rules meant that trees had to be removed for land to remain agricultural. And the rule of 50 trees per hectare has been in place until 2012. But in nature, plants don't grow in monocultures, whether that be trees or annual plants or perennials. Nature doesn't do monoculture because it's not particularly efficient and it's very, very risky. Nature has worked out that growing multiple things and filling the niches in space with different plants of different sizes and ages and lengths of duration is the most risk-averse way of production. And one of the things that got me very interested in agroforestry early on was the concept of temporal utilization of resources. So the graph here shows in yellow that an annual crop like wheat would take up nutrients and water and use light very early in the season, over the winter, early part of the spring, and then through the early part of the summer. But by midsummer, it's turned the solar panels off and it's shut down. Whereas trees wake up much later in the spring and they carry on right through to the autumn, to about where we are at this point in year in October or November, and then start losing their leaves and shutting down. So there's a real temporal overlap of utilizing those resources and extending the season for capturing sunlight. Equally, as farmers, we tend to think very two-dimensionally. But if we think about adding trees into the system, we can think about being three-dimensional farmers and using more space above ground and below ground, therefore making our farms bigger. Some work that was done by INRA in France, at Resti-Sinclair near Montpellier, showed, interestingly, very different root structures of trees grown under agroforestry or under forestry situations. The tree on the left is an 18-year-old poplar tree, and all the roots are very near the surface because that's where all the nutrients and water exist in the forest situation. Whereas with the agroforestry, the roots on the right are very different and much deeper, making that tree better anchored and also able to exploit the nutrients deeper in the soil profile. So with agroforestry, what we find is that when those trees wake up later in the season, the zone near the soil surface, the annual crop has used the water and nutrients, and therefore those trees have to look deeper in the soil profile and have for their nutrients and water, and therefore have a different root structure. So it's about partitioning the resources to making sure that the roots of the annual crop and the tree crop are not competing in the same space, but also not at the same time for the nutrients, the foods, and the water that they need to grow successfully. Moving on to sort of biodiversity, agroforestry is shown to have some real positive benefits in terms of providing high levels of biodiversity. This is some work done in the UK across 7 farms. My own farm has the purple ring around the data, but monitoring for biodiversity and pollinators as part of a PhD, 3-year PhD, showed that in most cases levels of biodiversity of species and abundance and the levels of pollinators was significantly higher in the agroforestry compared to monocultural situations on the same farms, and that was for both silvo-arable and silvopastoral systems. Work done by Jim McAdam in Northern Ireland on ash agroforestry and ash woodland versus grassland again showed similar trends with spiders, birds and beetles, with the agroforestry showing high levels of biodiversity in all cases. So agroforestry has the potential to enhance biodiversity by moving from monoculture to a polyculture or a more mixed environment, and in turn that has potential to help improve pest and predator control by providing host areas or refuge areas for beneficial insects, especially during the winter months. More recent work by Reading University in the United Kingdom looking at agroforestry benefits and biodiversity again has shown high levels of birds, fungi, insects, plants or wild plants, and most of those are beneficials. Where in silvo-arable systems we're seeing significantly more spiders, predatory beetles, parasitoid wasps and pollinators, and fewer of the pests, the midges and the root flies and fruit flies. Perhaps slugs are the only one that buck that trend. And these have been well reported in things like scientific journals such as Agriculture Ecosystems in the Environment and Agricultural Systems. And a recent journal article showed that agroforestry and silvo-arable systems providing 200% more solitary bees and hoverflies, 240% more bumblebees, and 10 times species higher richness. So agroforestry can really deliver on improving biodiversity. But biodiversity doesn't necessarily pay the bills on the farm. I'm often asked, what about the utilization of resources and competition for resources between the trees and the crops? What we're trying to do with an agroforestry system is change the local microclimate to improve soil and water quality protection, to minimize erosion, to reduce wind speed, and that's especially important in sort of maritime climates. So on the southern part of Sweden, around the sea, or in Denmark, here in the UK, where we get a lot of wind from the sea, reducing the cold in the winter and also the heat stress in the summer is going to be increasingly important for climate change. And we forget that wind is probably wind and sun are the two main vectors for removing water in terms of evapotranspiration from crops. So as the climate warms, reducing wind speed is going to be increasingly important. Some work again done in France looking at nitrate leaching under agroforestry systems shows that under forestry, typically not a lot of nutrients lost because not much nitrogen used in forestry. In agriculture here, it's expressing between 30 and 40 kilograms per hectare per year of nitrogen loss. In agroforestry, that can pretty much be halved because what the crops miss, the trees with their deeper roots can pick up that nitrogen, turn it into carbon and stopping it being lost out of the farming system. So there's an economic utilization of the nitrogen investment that's used in farming systems. So how do we compare productivity? If we look at monoculture in the background and agroforestry, trees and crops in the foreground, how can we compare that? Well, if you use the land equivalent ratio of productivity scenario, so that a level of 1 would be an equal level of productivity. If we can compare agroforestry with trees and crops grown together compared to trees and crops grown in separate parcels or in separate fields, we would need more land area to produce the same level of productivity when they're grown separately. And that can be calculated as a land equivalent ratio of 1.4. That means 100 hectares of agroforestry can produce as much crop and tree products combined as 140 hectares of farmland. So that's equivalent to 40% more productivity. I would say that's quite ambitious, and the research that's been done as part of a European project over 6 years, led by Cranfield University, showed that the land equivalent ratios typically are between sort of 1 and 1.4, with the majority around 1.2 or 1.3. But that's still 20 to 30% more productive. And if those of you watching Andy Howard's presentation earlier today, he showed very similar figures for using bicropping approaches. And in effect, agroforestry is the ultimate bicrop because you don't need to plant it each year. It's a mixture of perennials and annuals. There are some economic challenges with agroforestry. Obviously, annual crops versus perennial crops. The perennial crops take time to come to maturity and time to come to harvest. They're establishing market values for some of the perennial crops and some of the tree crops is perhaps more of a challenge to farmers who are used to annual crops. There is no additional market premium for agroforestry products, as you might expect, say perhaps from organic or biologic products. Both farmers and foresters use different economic metrics in terms of productivity and how they measure success. And farmers and foresters, we both speak different languages. Perhaps not quite so much in Sweden, where perhaps you have trees and crops as a more sister and brother crops on the same farm. As was mentioned by Sarah, there's a useful book I think could be useful to Swedish farmers interested in agroforestry that was published last year called the Agroforestry Handbook. It's a small practical book. It has information on about economics of agroforestry, about the economics of individual enterprises within agroforestry, about silvopastoral systems and productivity, and also about, in a UK context at least, about tree growth rates and management and tree yields. They could easily be sort of translated into a Swedish context. There's also some very interesting data on carbon, building on some of the work that the French have done, looking at both slow growing and quick growing trees at different plant densities, with a range of between 1.5, 1.5 to 4 tons per hectare per year of carbon, tons of carbon that can be sequestered. As carbon becomes an important currency within climate change, agroforestry has a really strong role to play in terms of perhaps carbon offsetting as part of getting income to farms to carbon offset from other businesses. I've put the download from the internet. There's a free download for the Agroforestry Handbook, so if farmers are interested, they can download it free as a PDF, and that hopefully will be useful. I already mentioned in relation to sort of climate change and carbon, we did some statistics here in the UK looking at the Paris Accord agreements that were looking to meet zero net carbon by 2050. We've got 72% of the UK land is farmland. If we used agroforestry and planted to 5.8% of farmland into tree canopy, we would meet our 17% canopy targets, but also our zero net target emissions under the Paris Accord. So agroforestry can play an important role there by moving from 11% to 17% land area while still retaining productivity. But some of the challenges of agroforestry around the confusion between forestry and agriculture. As I said, farmers and foresters have different goals, different interests, different objectives, and we use different language. Farmers and foresters, farmers have a good case of arborphobia, a fear of trees, and perhaps foresters have a good infection rate of agrophobia, an affliction against all crops that aren't a tree. and we need to overcome those and realize that they both have a role. And it's the multifunctional land use on the ground, but also the policies that allow that to happen that are going to be increasingly important as we move forward. And I was very pleased to see the previous presenter put the URAF logo on. I was the first vice chairman of URAF when we founded it in 2012. So there is lots of information on agroforestry, both through the Ag Forward program, through URAF and the Agro FE further education program, which we've been part of. So I will direct the information. To give you some ideas or some examples of agroforestry and how it can be used, both silvopastoral systems, trees and livestock, whether that be sheep or cattle or pigs, or I guess even elk, for that matter. There are lots of opportunities, and there's increasing interest to share a bit of data with you in using trees as part of the nutritional components for animals, both in terms of providing trace minerals and protein-rich leaves, and perhaps medicinal benefits and self-medication or diet supplementation. If you watch cattle and sheep in particular, they graze grass, but they also browse on shrubs and trees because they're getting different elements from those trees. So as farmers, we should watch our animals and plant trees within agroforestry to provide some of those benefits. Here's a table which shows the leaf nutrition in tree species compared to hay and silage from red clover. So we have some trees running down the left-hand side, and you can see here that there are very good levels of fat and also sugar and protein in some of these leaves. When you compare something like ash and its sugar and protein content, it's very similar to hay and clover. So at certain times of year, those animals are going to be browsing those trees to get the sugar, protein and fat as part of their diet because they can't get it from the grass. With regard to different animal types, cattle and horses and sheep and even goats, they have different elements of dietary intake in relation to trees. So cattle will, if given the choice, would take about 12% of their diet from perennial shrubs and trees, whereas sheep it would be 20%, goats 60%. But if all they've got is grass, that's all they'll eat. If we give them a more varied diet, it can make them more healthy, and they can supplement their diet with those higher protein, fats, and sugars. Animals will have different requirements at different points of the year in relation to their life cycle, and also whether they are pregnant or lactating or rearing young. So here's some data showing that young cows are grazing 19% of their time in the spring, 5.9% in early summer, and 5.4% in late summer. And that will be because of their life cycle and also because of the nutritional content in relation to the grass or the other components that they would be eating. So the farmer here is a dairy farmer in Western England. He's planted willow as part of agroforestry, as part of a dairy system, and his cows self-medicate on the willow, which has salicylic acid, which is a pain reliever. So they're using the willow like aspirin to actually reduce pain by self-browsing and self-medication. The pictures at the bottom here were a farm in southern England where we cut some ash branches, and the sheep were like bees to a honeypot, and they went straight for the trees and browsed all the leaves, because clearly there was mineral-rich leaves in the middle of summer that they weren't getting the minerals from the grass. Trees also provide a really important role in terms of shelter, both in terms of the winter, but also from wind. And in the summer, actually trees provide a really important role, and with climate change biting, providing shade is going to be increasingly important. Some data here from Lindsay Wistance in the UK, looking at lamb production, showing that where shelter is provided, the lamb mortality at birth is significantly lower, especially when you're getting to sort of multiple births of lambs. So providing shelter with agroforestry, a real win-win. So we're looking at agroforestry here, both in terms of upland agriculture, lowland agriculture, and also around watercourses to buffer and protect water sources in riparian areas. With climate change resulting in more flooding, there's an important role for putting the right trees in the right place to help slow down the flow across landscapes, improve infiltration, improve reductions in sediment loading, and also nutrient loss. If you're considering poultry as part of an agroforestry system, poultry are a woodland animal, they're a woodland fowl, and it's only us as humans have taken them out of that environment and put them in sheds or in open areas. They sit very well with agroforestry by extending their range and providing them more varied habitat and reducing predation. We've seen some uplift in brand premium by one of the supermarkets in the UK, teaming up with one of our woodland NGOs to create a woodland eggs brand, and that's been very popular. I'll keep skipping through some of these because we've got some pictures, but there are some pictures of both agroforestry, both crop production for grain, but also potentially for biomass with willow coppice, or perhaps even fruit and nuts. But it's important, I think, if we're using agroforestry as part of a silver arable system, we need to do it in a way, as Shell has just shown, that we can use field scale machinery, and then we don't have to buy lots of specialist machinery because that'll make it unpalatable to many farmers. But the rotation and timescales are much longer, and that's the element that farmers have to get to come to terms with, is that it can take a decade or more for the tree component to start producing a harvestable product. Is agroforestry scalable? Is it scalable to mainstream agriculture? I think yes. If I take some comparisons, there are 2,550,000 hectares of arable land, 6.3% in Sweden. In the UK, with 4.7 million hectares of arable land. I was fortunate to spend quite a bit of time in China, in Henan province, in black on the slide. That has 3.2 million hectares of agroforestry just in that one province. So it's eminently scalable, given the will and the right legislative and political environment and the right support for farmers. It's important to, obviously, when you're in China, to use all the space that's available. If any of you know the story of Gulliver's Travels, I stand quite tall at 6'3", and when in China, I was making sure that I was using all the available space, just like a tree within agroforestry, with my fellow colleagues who were considerably shorter. So I'll give you some experiences for 10 minutes over our own farming business in southern England and tell you how we've implemented agroforestry. So I farm in eastern England, just to the west of Cambridge and about 100 kilometres north of London. That's a nice picture of raining during harvest this summer, but that gives you an indication of where we are. I'm a first generation farmer. My wife and I started farming 13 years ago with a bag of tools and a lawnmower, and these were all we started with. We've built the farming business over the last 13 years. We farm in quite an open, flat landscape. And actually, you can see the agroforestry in the lower part of the picture there. Our cropping has changed quite considerably between 2007, 2008 through to 2020. We grow a lot more oats now. We have more agroforestry. We grow a lot more cover crops. The farm is now fully organically certified since 2010. When we started our journey, we farmed wheat, as the previous slide shows, wheat, oilseed rape, sugar beet, and some vegetables. We were producing field-scale vegetables, 50 hectares of broccoli and cauliflower for the supermarkets. We had a very good year, and then we had a very bad year, which nearly bankrupted the business and put us out of business because of the power of the supermarkets. So we stopped trying to produce field-scale vegetables. We thought about a more multifunctional land use and spreading our cropping and enterprises and having more diversity to try and improve soil protection, build conservation for nature and habitat creation, and open up new markets. And what became apparent in those early years of farming this farm was that soil erosion was a major issue from the wind. We saw our most precious resource, our soils, being eroded, and I wanted to do something about combating that and improving our sustainability situation. The limitations for us that the farm is actually rented. We don't own the farm. We had when we started a 15-year agreement for the farm. Our land owners needed to make sure that we retained our common agricultural policy eligibility, so we didn't fall foul of the common agricultural policy. We needed to we had limited capital and money, and we needed to be profitable, and we had no livestock facilities. So we actually decided through some research that I'd done and work that I'd been doing in Africa many years ago, we decided to put an agroforestry system in place based on 85 trees per hectare, focused around fruit trees. So in 2009, we planted 52 hectares at 885 trees per hectare, 3 meters between each tree in the row, 24 meters or 27 meters between the tree lines, and 24-meter working alleys in between. They were all facing nearly north-south, so that the sun gets to both sides of the tree lines, so to minimize shading, and we left 24-meter turning areas at the end of each alley. The trees were planted as 2-year-old trees in 2009. We made sure we engaged the local school children to come and have it as part of their lessons, math lessons and physics and geography lessons. My hope was that in 2009 it would get them enthused about agroforestry, and in 2020 they would all become fruit pickers. Some 11 years later, they're all now teenagers, but the internet connection isn't good enough for their iPhones in the fields, so they're not quite as interested. This was closely followed in 2009 by the coldest winter we'd had in 15 years, and then followed in 2010 by the driest spring in 30 years. So the trees had a real baptism of fire to contend with. But overall, we only lost about 5% of the trees that we planted, so I think it's a pretty good result. So we're using field scale machinery still across the farm when we started, and we've moved to, as the trees have grown, we've moved to different crops and different methods of management. The farm is now fully organically certified from 2010, and we're drilling using a 6-meter drill and a controlled traffic farming system. And we're using a 6-meter drill to sow cereal crops, and a Garford robo crop automated computer-guided hoe system to hoe between the cereals. What that allows us to do is to develop the controlled traffic farming system, and all our machinery is now 6 meters, which runs really well between the alleys of trees. So a few pictures of how the farm looks. This summer. So we have crops of wheat and oats growing between the fruit trees. We have pollen and nectar species, 30 different pollen and nectar species growing underneath the trees, with lots of bees. And here you can see the tram lines for the wheelings. So there are 4 of those across the alley to allow the 6-meter controlled traffic farming system. We have about 40,000 head of bees, lots of beehives to help pollinate the tree crops. So we're growing wheat. There's wheat later in the year. We're growing oats, cereal crops organically, and the trees aren't a hindrance to that. There's a picture from the air that you can actually see the trees growing with the 4 lines of 6 meters in between the tree crops themselves. And then in summer we can harvest the wheat and the oats, and then go back and harvest the fruit after the wheat or oats has been harvested. So we have 2 crops out of the same field, just as Shell was expressing and explained before. One of the benefits that we've seen in the last 2 years, so in 2019 we had severe storms in the middle of summer, and in the fields where we don't have agroforestry, which is roughly half the farm, we lost about 20% of the grain through the oats being threshed and the seed going onto the ground. In the agroforestry, because of the reduction in wind speed, we reduced those losses by 50%, because we actually slowed down the wind, and the crops weren't affected anywhere near as badly. We did lose a few apples, but overall the economic benefit of reducing the wind speed was very significant. And in 2020, this year, we've had a very wet winter last winter, and also a very dry spring. And what was very significant this year was that adjacent to the tree line, where the arrow is, the crop of cereals or oats here was significantly better adjacent to the trees than it was in the middle of the field, which is normally the reverse. So as you can see with the picture here, the oats were much taller and yielded better adjacent to the tree lines. Excuse me. And my observation is that in the winter there was better drainage adjacent to the trees, and in the summer there was better moisture retention and perhaps some hydraulic lift of moisture by the tree roots, bringing moisture to the soil surface, which the crops could then, annual crops could benefit from. So just a few pictures of the farm to finish, to say that we have been doing a lot of soil health monitoring, and we've seen significant higher levels of mycorrhizae and soil fungi adjacent to the trees, which is again part of the improved soil conditions for improved crop growth. And we've been monitoring soil biology as well as soil nutrients and seeing positive benefits with the agroforestry. As I mentioned before, we've developed a controlled traffic farming system, meaning that all our machinery is now 6, 12 or 24 meters wide. It means we're traveling in the same place, and the agroforestry lends itself very well to that. So instead of trafficking all over the fields, we're limiting where we place the tractors. This is also allowing us to companion plant, as we heard from Andy Howard earlier on. We're undersowing our crops and companion planting with legumes, which is working very well as part of that controlled traffic farming system. We've been developing value-added markets for our cereals. We're one of the few farms in the UK that's going a certified gluten-free oat product, which gives us an organic premium, but also a gluten-free premium. We're taking our fruit crops and turning that into juice, but through processing. Some figures of productivity for those farmers who always like figures. If we take just the wholesale value of our organic oats, they're around €1,000, 1,600 euros per hectare. With the wheat, it's about 1,200 euros per hectare, and our fruit is about 1,880 euros per hectare. If we turn that into fresh fruit sales, or we turn it into fruit juice, we can treble that value. So one of the things we did 2 years ago was to take a barn in our farmyard and do some building work, and we've turned that into a farm shop and cafe. Sadly, as of today, our cafe is shut because of the national lockdown, which came into force today due to COVID, but we're still providing local food and producing our fruit juice for sale through the farm shop. So some of the unexpected issues that we've seen from agroforestry are that security was a bit of an issue. We live in a very dense populated area, and we were worried about young trees being stolen, so we had to put gates up in fields to stop people stealing trees. We've had climate challenges from dry and wet periods. We've had to do some re-guarding with damage from large rabbits and hares. We had some damage from pigeons and birds when the trees were young, but now that's not an issue. Now the trees are older. You have to be cautious of your neighbours and road safety, because when they're driving, they're looking sideways, looking at the trees rather than down the road. And we found that there's lots of small aeroplanes circle us because they're interested in seeing the agroforestry. So my concluding thoughts to finish are that agroforestry is ecological intensification. It's improving resource capture and use. Profitability can be equal to or greater than monoculture. It's providing enhanced biodiversity as well as soil and environmental protection. It's usable in both upland systems and grazed or silver arable systems with densities of 80 to 120 trees per hectare on 24 or 36 metre alleys. The alley crops maintain the annual income, and the trees provide a long-term income and capital asset. But as in most countries, policy is having to catch up with the innovation that farmers are undertaking. And I expect that's no different in Sweden than it is here in the UK. So as humans, we learned that we could go from single-story dwellings into multi-story dwellings, and perhaps even into high-rise to use space efficiently. Agroforestry could be a climate-smart breakthrough for agriculture. This is walnut and wheat growing in France. Farmers don't need to do their whole farms. They could do 20% of their land area as agroforestry. Here in the UK, we've calculated 5.8% of the land area as agroforestry would meet our Paris zero net carbon climate ambitions. Trees will go in most places given the opportunity. They help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, help protect natural resources, and at the same time produce more food and biomass. So I would encourage you to think about perhaps tomorrow morning when you've had your first cup of coffee and you walk out of the door, that you take a moment and you look up at the sky and you look down at the ground and you think about all the extra space that you could be farming in a three-dimensional way using agroforestry. And remind yourselves also that sometimes the only thing that's holding you back is the way you think about things. Okay, thank you very much.
Many thanks for your presentation, Stephen. It was a really nice presentation. We have a lot of questions for you in the chat, and we are happy that you can stay with us for the panel discussion in a while. Is that so?
Yep.
Perfect. Then we will go on a 15-minute break, and at 3 o'clock we will meet back here and we will meet Johanna Björklund. Johanna Björklund kommer att prata klockan 3. Vi tar 15 minuters paus och Steven kommer att finnas kvar vid paneldiskussionen om ungefär 35-40 minuter. 15 minutes break.